Okay, it looks like we're live on YouTube. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I'm McKenna Jordan. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I could not be more excited to be joined by these two ladies here tonight. I am a big fan of both of theirs, and I'm so glad that this worked out. So we are here tonight to celebrate the release of This Time Next Year We'll Be Laughing, which is Jacqueline Winspear's new memoir. We have signed copies of it available, and in just a minute, I'll be putting a link in the comments if you'd like to order the books. Link will be there. Also, we're joined by Doree Shafrir from the Forever 35 podcast, as well as lots of other things. Let me get them introduced, and then I'm going to go away and let them chat for a bit. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will be monitoring them, and we'll try to get to them in a little bit. So, Doree Shafrir is a writer and podcaster. Her first novel, Startup, was published by Little Brown in 2017. She co-hosts the Forever 35 podcast with Kate Spencer and the Matt and Doree's Eggcellent Adventure podcast with her husband. She is a former senior writer for BuzzFeed News and has also worked as an editor or staff writer at Rolling Stone, the New York Observer, Gawker, and Philadelphia Weekly, and has contributed to publications including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Slate, and Wired. She lives in LA with her husband, son, and dog. Hi, Doree. How are you tonight?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
I could not be more excited.
I'm very excited as well.
Excellent. Jacqueline Winspear was born and raised in Kent, England. After graduating from the University of London's Institute of Education, she worked in academic publishing, higher education, and marketing communications. She immigrated to the United States in 1990. She has written 15 novels in the New York Times bestselling Maisie Dobbs series, which has won numerous awards, including the Agatha, Macavity, and Alex. Her standalone novel about the Great War, The Care and Management of Lives, was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. She lives in California. Hi, Jackie.
It's lovely to see you again, McKenna. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. And for those who are Murder by the Book regulars, just in case you're wondering, my dog, Maisie Dobbs, has had a chance to say hello to Jackie before we went live, so she is not being left out of the equation. Okay, again, pop any questions in the comments. I'll be monitoring them, and I'm going to sit back and listen to the talk. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Jackie, it's such a pleasure to be doing this with you. I'm sure there are some Forever 35 listeners who are watching this, and we really enjoyed having you on the podcast. And so it's really nice to just see you in person, quote unquote, now. So let's talk about your new memoir, which I really enjoyed. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book, which focuses mostly on your parents and your childhood and adolescence? Mm-hmm. Why did you want to write a memoir, and why did you want to focus on this period in particular in your life?
There's a couple of ways of looking at that question. And first of all, let's just say memoir was one of my first literary loves. I love memoir. The first memoir I read, I think I must have been about 10 or 11. And it was called Life with Mother Superior by a writer called Jane Trahey. It was later made into a movie with Rosalind Russell and Hayley Mills. And what I loved about it, even at that age, was this girl who lived in Chicago and had a very different upbringing to me. I mean, so different. And yet there were all these sort of points of connection. And though I could not explain this at the time in these words, but what I loved was how the personal could become the universal, how someone could write something about their lives, and I could understand this, even though my life was very different. So, memoir became something of a love of mine. I then grew to love writing personal essays when I later became a writer, having the day job and, the writing as well as the day job. Mm-hmm. And I really loved the personal essay. And again, it was how something that affected you personally, something that you had gone through, could resonate with something else that had happened in the world, and that you could comment upon it through telling a story. So I loved that. And then I started really looking at memoir and realizing that, and this is going back a long way, I wanted to write a memoir. And here are some of the things I loved about memoir, because I think I learned a lot about writing from reading memoir. I love the way that in memoir, the writer can zoom in to a certain scene and just, and that scene will tell you a lot about everything else that's happened. Or you can pan through a complete panorama and tell you something about time and place. But I wanted to tell this story in the way I've told it because I always kind of knew, even as a kid, that what had gone before me impacted my life. Therefore, what happened to my grandparents in their lives, what happened to my aunts and uncles and cousins in their lives was part of my life in a bigger way. I could never have explained that when I was 10, but I just knew it. And then as I grew older and, you know, grew into adulthood, there was that sense of this, it's like having a thread behind you that is always pulling on you. And I knew it was really important to write, particularly about my parents, because I actually think my parents had, for their day, a kind of an extraordinary story. And that extraordinary story really fed into, you know, my brother and I and how we envisaged our lives to be. So
when did you kind of realize that your parents had an extraordinary story?
When I realized that no one else had quite that same story at school. I always knew they'd had this, and actually, to be quite honest, it was when I suffered a little bit of some bullying at school, and I realized that certain other kids' parents knew about this period of my parents' life when they were living, you know, pretty close to the land in very simple circumstances. And that it had fed down to me, and even though my life was not like that. This was, you know, my parents got away from post-war London. And just to give an example, I mean, of what post-war London must have looked like. I mean, the last bomb sites in London were actually removed from the East End area to build the 2012 Olympics, the Olympic stadiums. There were still some bomb sites there. And so, you know, I was born in the mid-50s. And so, I remember, you know, when I was 5 or 6 years old, into the 60s, going up to London with my parents, because that's where they were from. And I would be out with my cousins playing on bomb sites, you know, and it was so different from where I played, which was fields and forests. And my parents, you know, were married in 1949. And, you know, it was almost impossible for a young married couple, and they were just 22 years old, to get a place to live, because look at the housing stock that had come down. And they jumped at the chance to buy an old gypsy caravan, and they had it towed down to Kent, put on a farm, and that's where they lived for, 5 or so years until I came along. And so, you know, if I think of my mother, you know, she was a fashion plate. I mean, she had the latest fashions, you know, the first girl in her neighborhood to be wearing the new look, you know, with its 2 inches above the ankle hemline. And she had her clothes tailored and things like that. My dad was pretty dashing. And then almost overnight, they're in jeans and, you know, Wellington boots. And that was it, you know, working on farms. I thought that was pretty extraordinary.
Oh, certainly. I think when you grow up with it, it's hard to understand that kind of contextually your parents' story is unusual. So I was just kind of curious about that. I did get the sense that a lot of what you're writing about in your book is kind of this notion of generational trauma. You know, your mother seemed to really have PTSD from being in a bombing during World War II, and your grandfather was greatly traumatized by his experience in World War I. And it did seem like both of their trauma in particular, but especially your mother's, greatly affected you. And I was hoping you could talk about what it was like to grow up with that trauma. And I'm also curious, did writing about it in your memoir help you process it in a new way?
That's a very good question. When I was growing up, it was just, to some extent, just part of my mother's story. She would tell stories about being down the shelter, about walking through the blackout. But some of her stories were pretty pointed, pretty raw, about seeing the dead after a bombing and having a house come down upon her. and those kinds of things, and also the absolute utter trauma that she suffered through being evacuated from her, along with her siblings, and what that did to her. So I was both, I mean, she was a great storyteller. So you sat on the edge of the seat, even if you'd heard the story 10 times. And I heard the story time and time again. So I was aware of that. And that I think when I was smaller, there was a certain detachment. But then there was that one episode, and I talk about it and write about it in the memoir, when I was a little girl and she had what we would today call a panic attack. It was complete reflex action when she heard a siren, and boom, she grabbed us both, in the way with my brother and I, into a doorway. And I was 5 years old, and I knew exactly what was happening to her. I said, "Mummy, it's okay, there aren't any bombs." So there was that. But then, it was as I grew older, and I think particularly since she passed away 5 years ago, that's when I realized how those memories had leached into me. And that in my work, I was constantly exploring what war does to people, constantly looking at that, constantly picking it apart, and that it had an impact on me. And writing the memoir, while at once it helped me to look at that in a different way, it also brought it all up again. So
Right.
that, just we've all been in lockdown and so on, and people have said to me, "Oh, have you seen such and such? Oh, have you seen 1917? Have you seen this film?" And they mention war films to me. I said, "I just can't watch it. I just cannot do it. I have immersed myself into that world that I want to get out of it when I'm not immersed in it."
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's like having your feet in sort of quicksand. You've got to get away from it, because other people's memories, and especially when you have sucked them up like that, they live within you. And I think even that goes for a lot of people, except that I've managed to explore it. You don't realize how much your experiences of those who've gone before are right in your, almost in your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I've seen this in other friends whose parents have gone through traumas and so on. It lives in them. And one of a book I actually quote in my memoir is called War Child, and was written by a man called Martin Parsons, who was the director of at a university in England, as an institute for the study of the war child. He particularly looked at evacuees, but he realized in his research, in the research done in the institute, that an experience of war can take 3 generations to work its way through the family system.
Wow.
So if I think of someone like myself, my grandfather went to war. Oh, and my grandmother on my father's side, my paternal grandmother, sorry, it was my maternal grandmother, she was partially blinded in an explosion at a munitions factory. So there was that war, and then there was my parents' war, but particularly my mother. My dad was a different kind of storyteller. You didn't hear much from him. It was just, I think he just got on with things in a different way. But I also saw how his life was impacted by his father's shell shock, and that came out because I would have to piece it out of him where a mum should tell you, so you see how this, it's almost like a sack of memories that you carry around with you, even if you don't know that the memories are there, just in the behaviors that you have observed as you grow older. So I think I wanted to pick that apart a bit in my memoir, but of course, a memoir is full of not just, it's light as well. It has light, and it's the things that elevate us as well as the things that we have to chew over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, we've brought up your mother a few times, and your relationship with your mother, at least the way you portrayed it, was complicated. You worshipped her. She was an amazing dresser, as you said, and she was incredibly smart and an ambitious career. She had an ambitious career and all these kind of wonderful things, but she could also be extremely cruel and manipulative. But I liked how you portrayed her as so multidimensional. I mean, you could have easily painted her as like completely evil, you know, the evil mother figure. And it,
No, she wasn't.
and it, yeah, and it did remind me of the way in which so many of your Maisie Dobbs characters are so complex. And you really kind of do force the reader to reckon with this idea that like people are complicated, people are multidimensional. And I'm wondering, do you think that growing up with a mother like yours did influence the way that you perceive people?
I don't know the answer to that question, but probably very much so. But I think also one of the things is being raised in a very rural area, and for, you know, to some extent, when you live like that, you don't have your friends just up the road or anything. You live quite a solitary life as a child, and characters, you see everyone as a character. You see your animals as characters. You observe more. I was a really actually observant to the point of being a nosy kid. But here's something I can remember. The memoirist Hope Edelman. I actually went along to one of her. It was at Hedgebrook on Whidbey Island, the women's writing retreat. A couple of years ago, I saw that there was a masterclass, a memoir masterclass, and I thought, you know what, I'd like to go along to that. So I did. And here's something that I remember her saying. It was very much a retreat to just get down to your writing. But here's something I remember Hope saying: remember what was tender. Ask yourself what was tender. And there was so much about my mother that was tender. You could not beat my mother's smile. You couldn't beat my mother's smile. I loved to see her smile because her frown was pretty grim. And she had so many kindnesses, but I always tried to remember that there were pressures upon her as well, and to try and give her leave, if you will, for that. So I think it's always being able to see a balance in people. And I'm very much one of these people that I see someone, and if there is a behavior that is not very nice, let's say, not very becoming, I think, where did that come from? What hurt you for you to be like this? And funnily enough, it was by the time I was a teenager, I got that from my mother because of where she worked. She was a chief administrator, eventually in the government home office prisons department. She was not in a disciplinary role. It was purely administrative. And at one point, one of her first jobs was in what they called then a detention center. You might call it juvie hall here. For boys, they were not first offenders. They were second or third offenders, but they were under 20, under 21. And I can remember she came home really tired one day, and I asked her about it. And I think the job on that particular day was sort of getting to her a bit. And I said, why do you think what do you think goes wrong with people? What goes wrong? And she said, I can remember her saying to me, somewhere along the line, someone didn't care. Somewhere along the line, someone didn't get love, didn't get support, didn't get attention. Now, that's not true for everyone. Obviously, there are different circumstances. But it was that always trying to look at people as they are more than what they seem. So that if someone's having a bad day, I've always, what's at the root of the bad day? That there's something has happened. And sometimes there are big things in life and smaller things. And even when I was at school, I can remember I used to think, if there was someone who was perhaps not very nice, why are they not very nice? What has hurt them? It's that old thing, people who do harm
hurt people.
Yeah, hurt people. So I think that I'm sure that it was very difficult for my mum when I became a teenager and had lots of the opportunities that she didn't, and yet she would have shed blood to get me those opportunities. She would have fought, and she did fight to get me opportunities. And my brother, she liked to scrap, though, I've got to tell you. She liked to scrap.
Yeah,
the mistress said, what? I'm going to go to see her.
I was going to say, you have that anecdote where you're at school and the your teacher says that you might not want to go to the grammar school because of, you're in a different class. Yeah. And your mother was not having it.
No, she actually called my mother in to have it, because my father would never have gone up there because he thought, I want to do that sort of thing. So my mother was always the one that would take care of anything to do with the school. Not that my father was disinterested, but there's another reason about my dad, which I talk about in the book. But my mom was called to the school so that the headmistress could discuss with her the fact that perhaps it wasn't a good idea for me to go on to another school because I wasn't the right social class. And oh, whoa, boy, was that the wrong thing to say to my mum. I remember her coming home and saying, she reckons you're not, I'll give her the wrong social class. And I thought, I bet that headmistress, I just remember thinking, oh no, what did she do? Because my mum was a tall lady, so she was a lot taller than my headmistress for a start. And she would always dress as if she was going into battle, the black suit, the black, pumps, and her hair in a French twist. And my aunts are the same, they're kind of Amazons. They're very tall, well, they're obviously a few have passed away now, but very tall, almost, let's say there's certainly a certain dignity about them. So yeah, she was always ready for a go at someone, I'll tell you that.
It was really interesting to read about all of the kind of class and social standing issues in your memoir, because that's such a running theme in the Maisie Dobbs books. Maisie comes from this kind of poor background, and through a patron, she kind of is elevated in social status. And it did seem like in your book, your parents they did kind of move up in the world, which seems like in Britain, especially where the classes are so sort of stratified, and especially, 70 years ago, that must have been really difficult. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like your class identity and moving among classes, and how that also got manifested in the Maisie Dobbs books, because I think for Americans that's still kind of it's not a concept that I think we easily grasp.
It's a different kind of class consciousness here. It's based on education and to some extent money and so on, but in Britain it's to do with quote unquote your station in life and the job you do to some extent. And a lot of people tell me, oh, that doesn't exist anymore, and oh, everything's changed. But you know what, you cannot get rid of thousands of years of that behavior overnight. And I just last week heard from one of my friends who was she'd been reading the memoir, and she was just laughing. She said, oh boy, do I know this, about for example, the different words that you use to describe each meal, and how ordinary working class people are different from middle class and upper class. And by the way, middle class in Britain is quite different from middle class here. If you worked in a factory in Britain, you wouldn't necessarily be called middle class. If you work with your hands or whatever, you're usually, unless you are of the royal family and you happen to be a carpenter, you're firmly in the working class. And funnily enough, my brother, just as an aside, is a landscape gardener in California. And I can remember when he was the manager for a very, very large estate here at quite a young age. And he said, if I still lived in Britain, I would never get this at this age I am now. I wouldn't be managing a big estate like this. I mean, he's got his own business now. And he said, I would be seen as a serf. I would still be seen as a serf, unless. But growing up with that, I guess I was always aware, and certainly my parents were very clear about where we were on the social scale, so to speak. But that didn't mean that we weren't above striving to be. It's like being on a station, they used to call it your station in life. And I can remember thinking it's like waiting for a train to take you somewhere else, and that somewhere else is a better place. But I think that growing up, there was this sense that, as they used to say, although it wasn't word used in our house, they were what they referred to as your betters, you know. And that was something one of my grandmothers would say, your betters, because when she was a girl, I think she was 12, and she went to work in service. You know, she was a Maisie Dobbs in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, it is something that we grow up with. And it's really interesting because I can remember, you know, in the area, you'd see maybe someone who was working at a gas station or something, or being a mechanic, and they were considered very much working class. They were probably earning more than a teacher, but if you were a teacher, you're very much middle class, you know. And so there were these, it's hard to explain the fine distinctions unless you're there, but they do exist, and to this day they exist. But I do, just as an aside, I remember, I think it was in the mid-80s, suddenly the Cockney accent became quite fashionable, which is, it never used to be that fashionable. And it seemed that every sort of, you know, advertising executive working in London was speaking with the Cockney accent because it became fashionable, which was really funny when you think, why are you talking like that? You know, I've spent my whole life not talking like that.
Right. You have an anecdote where your father is embarrassed to come to school, right? Because
that's why he did. My dad was a real dyed-in-the-wool, born within the sound of the Bow Bells Cockney, because that's what designated a Cockney, was you were born within the sound of the Bow Bells. Bow Bells, that means from Bow in East London. And if you were born within the sound of those bells, you were a Cockney. And actually, it goes back to when London was tribal, and you know, all the different tribes had their own way of speaking. And you know, Cockney rhyming slang, if you spoke with rhyming slang, other people couldn't understand what you were talking about. And my dad actually spoke in rhyming slang, you know, to some extent. But he had quite an accent. I mean, he sounded like early Michael Caine, which I think is incredibly attractive. I loved listening to him. But he didn't like going to the school to open days because he was frightened that if he opened his mouth to speak to the teachers, he would let me down. And that broke my heart, actually, that my dad would think that, because my dad was always, I mean, my parents were there for us, and my dad was very much there for me. He was, you know, I knew people that were very wealthy, kids that were very wealthy, and they didn't have dads like my dad, you know. So he had so much depth as a person, and very curious. Both my parents were very curious in different ways about the world, and I loved both of them for their curiosity. My dad's was very much about the natural world, very much about other cultures, you know. I mean, he was like a walking National Geographic even before he'd ever got on a plane for the first time.
Wow.
So, you know, that's why I guess one of the things I bring out in my fiction as well is the depth that you can find in people, from different kinds of people, and the depth they might have, the curiosity they might have about the world around them, and the fact that people are multidimensional, and that people have different experiences, that you can have money and then not have money, and you can not have money and then have money, and how does it impact your life? And I think it's as a writer, it's fascinating to weave character in that way, to really give characters a depth and a background and a sense of who they are in the world. So yeah, I think that some of those early experiences, they definitely stayed with me, and absolutely my parents' attitude to the world around them. And very much there was a time, you know, particularly when I was younger, when it was almost as if they gave me the impression that the rest of the world would be against me at every turn. Even if that was not so. That's the impression, that it's always going to have to be a fight. So I was even fighting when I didn't, and when I don't mean fisticuffs fighting, I mean against the world, when there was no need for me to do that.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about your writing process? How you write a lot of Maisie Dobbs books, pretty frequently. You have another one coming out in March, which I want to get to. But I'm wondering, do you have do you wake up every day and write at the same time? What are your sort of rituals around writing?
I like to get my writing done in the morning. And here's a perfect writing day. And that's changing a little bit because my writing day used to start with taking my dog for a walk. And sadly, we recently had to have her laid to rest, so that my mornings,
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to get a different kind of morning going at the moment because, it's really interesting. You take the dog for a walk and you're thinking about your day while you're walking and, taking the dog for a walk and maybe saying hello to neighbors, but it's just all going on in there, what your day is going to be about. So anyway, I get up. I like to start work absolutely no later than 8:30. And then a typical writing day would be working all the way through initially till about 1 o'clock. So usually about 5 solid hours. And then usually it's a, bite to eat. And because I need a break, I need to get out. At that point, I go to ride my horse. And I'm usually out at the ranch. And actually, my horse is not here at the moment. He's somewhere else. But still, that's okay. This is how most of my day goes. And then I'm home by about 4 o'clock again, 4:30. Quick cup of tea. Always have to have a quick cup of tea. And then I don't necessarily go back to what I've written in the morning. But what I do is deal with the admin that goes with my work. Because there's a lot of admin. There's always something going on with a book, a question from someone or from my publisher or whatever. Or more particularly, I'm doing research. There's something I want to look up to check. And in the evenings, we have dinner usually about 7 o'clock, something like that. And yes, I'll sometimes like to watch a movie or read a book. When I'm writing fiction, I do not read fiction at all. I don't want someone else's voice to leach into me. And it's really easy to do that if you're not careful. I want only my voice in my work. But I do often, I might watch a documentary that is reflective of what I'm writing at the time, or I'm reading something. I'm reading something to immerse myself in that era, and or I'm thinking about what's coming next. For example, at the moment, to tell you the truth, I'm without giving the game away, I've been reading a lot about Eleanor Roosevelt just recently, and also Spitfires. I'm trying to figure out how I can possibly pluck up courage to have one of those test rides in a Spitfire.
Wow.
It's just like, yeah, maybe I'll go up, but do not do the loop, because I'm not doing that. But so my writing day is prescriptive in a way, but it leaves room for maneuver. One thing that I think this shows that I'm maybe a little bit competitive. Many years ago, I think I'd published about 3 books when I read Stephen King's book on writing, which to this day I think is one of the best books on writing. And he happened to mention in it that you can lay down the first draft of a novel based upon about, 100,000 words in 3 months if you write 1,200 words a day. And because I'm a bit competitive, I thought, I bet I can do more than 1,200 words a day. So
oh my goodness.
I don't like to leave my desk unless I do at least 1,200 words a day. And here's another, I think, important part of my process that I do as I go along. I absolutely do not go back over work. I see myself as a storyteller. I'm not an editor at that point. I'm not tinkering around. I want to tell my story. Now, that first draft, when I've done it, let's say my 100,000 words, all that is a lump of clay on a wheel. It's a lump of clay. Then I have to go in and I have to shape it. And that's when I become a technician of the word, someone who is looking more closely at how I've structured a scene, how I listen, I sort of try to hear my own dialogue and so on. But I've always seen that as akin to being a sculptor, that I've got that clay on the wheel and now I'm going to go in and I'm going to massage it. And I want to make it into the story that I want it to be. and that I've envisaged.
I love that. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So before we get to some questions from the audience, you have a new Maisie Dobbs book coming out in March.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about the book?
A little bit. It opens. Okay, I'm going to a clue. It opens in October 1941, and all I will say is that the action in the book goes on for a couple of months. And those of you that, well, actually, yes, it goes on for a couple of months. And those of you that know your history will know what happened in the final closing months of 1941. I will add that one of the main characters is based upon, yet again, something that my dad did in the war. To Die But Once was based. There's a young apprentice in there that does a job that my dad also did in the war. But before my dad became an apprentice, when he was in, it was before war broke out. War broke out in Britain. War was declared in September 1939. My dad was 13, coming up to 13. But even before that, so he's sort of 12 years old. He was a really, really, really fast runner, absolute brilliant sprinter. In fact, to his dying day, I mean, he loved, he would run everywhere. But the ARP, the Air Raid Precautions guys, came round to the schools, plucking out from each school one or two of the fastest runners in their school, in London schools, this is in London, to run messages when war started, because they knew war was coming. They knew there would probably be a conflict, there would be bombings, and they needed them to run messages between air raid precautions depots and places like that, government buildings. And that's what my dad did. And he was 12, so he was 26. So yeah, by the time he started, he was just coming up to 13. And he would leave school and then he would run messages throughout, the evening to different places through the bombings.
Wow.
And I can remember, when he told me that, thinking to myself, and I didn't know that until about 20 years ago. And I told you that my dad kept his stories, and I know McKenna wants to come on, so I'll tell you this very quickly. But we were sitting around my kitchen table in California, and my parents had been in the country a few days on a visit, and I had some friends around to meet them. And I was saying to everyone how my dad was just this brilliant runner as a kid. And of course, he always wanted either my brother and I to be sprinters, and we're just terrible sprinters. We're pretty good long distance runners, but we could never get over 100 yards very quickly. and this one friend said to my dad, "Oh, were you a runner in the war?" And my dad said, "Funny you should say that, but I was." My mom even looked and said, "Really?" And this whole story came out. That's what I mean. My dad squirreled his stories away. And I remember thinking, I wasn't even a writer then, but I can remember, or I wasn't a published author. I remember thinking, there's a story there. And I had to come back to it. So there you go. Yeah. So that's as much as I'm going to tell you about the consequences of fear coming from 2021. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I know I will be anxiously awaiting a copy to read for sure. So a couple of little announcements for those of you who've tuned in but maybe missed the beginning. Give YouTube a couple hours to process this video once we're done with it being live, and it will be available to watch from the start indefinitely on our YouTube channel. So you can come back and check it out if you missed something. I know people have been joining us as we go along. We do have a couple questions, but before I get to that, I just wanted to say once again, we have the new book. This time next year, we'll be laughing, and signed copies available. Not a question from the audience, but I will selfishly say that Jackie told a story, I think the first or second time she was at the store, about her grandfather soaking his legs. And I think it's such a poignant story. And since we're talking about family history, I was wondering if you could tell that this evening.
Sure. My grandparents were staying with us. I was a little girl. I just loved my grandparents. And of course, living in the country, we hardly saw our family from London. So it was pretty wonderful. And my granddad was lovely. I was named after him. His name was Jack. That's why I was called Jacqueline. And I heard him get up one morning and go downstairs. And so I padded downstairs after him. And we had a staircase going from sort of the dining room down into the kitchen. And at that point, I think we still didn't have hot running water in the house. So on the stove overnight, my parents would put these two big sort of like cauldrons of water, and it would be warm by the morning. And as I was sitting there, I heard him go downstairs. And then I sat on the stairs watching him in the kitchen, you know, a little spy. You know how kids can be spies? I was doing a spy thing. And I watched as he filled a bowl with warm water, very warm, because I could see the steam coming up, and then put salt in it, copious amount of salt. He set it on the floor. He pushed a chair in front of the bowl, and he rolled up his pajama bottoms, and put his legs into the water, and he began to bring the water up around his shins. And at that point, my dad came downstairs, and as he came down the stairs, he looked at me as if to say, you know, what are you doing here? And he gave me a hug, and he said, oh, spying again, you know, and gave me a kiss, good morning. And I watched as he went up to his father, and he put his arm around him, and he said, you all right, Dad? And he said, yeah, I'm all right, son. And my dad then knelt at his feet, and he began massaging his father's legs and bringing a cloth so that the warm water would bathe his father's legs. And I can remember seeing these livid purple scars on his legs. And then my father he paid attention to one point in particular, and I saw him pull something out, and he just put it on sort of a piece of paper on the table or something. And what he was actually pulling out, I found out later, was a shrapnel shard, tiny little, you know, like a little needle. And my grandfather was severely wounded in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And of course, battlefield surgery, they clean you up a bit, then they stitch you up, and then they send you home as soon as you can go. So like many quote unquote old soldiers, he still had metal inside him. And every now and again, those little shards of shrapnel would come to the surface and have to be teased out. And he was still removing shrapnel from his legs from 1916 when he died in 1966. So 50 years. And I think I never forgot that. And I asked questions about it. I was terrible for asking all these questions. It was, what happened to Granddad? Da, da, da. But it always remained with me. And I think in a way, how can I say? It's almost a metaphor for so many of the things I've explored in my work. Because, you know, war is, as Lady Rowan says in Birds of a Feather, war's never over when it's over. It lives on inside the living. It's still being teased out of people that have lived through war. And I saw that in my grandfather. I saw it in my mother, and to some extent in my dad. But I've seen that in people. And I think anybody listening who has a loved one who has been into a war zone will know exactly what I'm talking about. That the shards of experience are always coming to the surface. I know that's the story you wanted me to tell.
That is the story, because number one, the level of detail in the story and the fact that that's something you lived obviously informs your series of books, right? Set in that time period. So obviously you not only have this actual detail that is so relevant, but also, as you said, metaphorically, it goes throughout the series of how the war has impacted the characters in their everyday lives. So I love that story. So we do have a couple of questions. Jenny was wondering, she said, Eleanor Roosevelt is such a fascinating lady. Are there any other books or guilty pleasures you've been gravitating towards, especially during this pandemic? And I think we can actually let both of you answer that. Any guilty pleasures?
Actually, do you know one of my guilty pleasures? I really love books about place. And I think it's actually, you know, Doree was asking me about, what writing the memoir brought up for me. And it brought up my love, which I've always known was there, but it's just come back in a big way. My love of the land and my love of agriculture And you know, I mean, I don't know if anyone watching has seen The Biggest Little Farm. I mean, I cried through that film, and it's a documentary. And I've been reading a lot of books about how so many farmers, small farmers in particular, are trying to rewild their land. Instead of, you know, the big industrial farms, they're going back to that. So I've been reading books about the land a lot, and about our relationship to the land. And that's been a real guilty pleasure. I love immersing myself in time and place. So that's one of my guilty pleasures.
How about you, Doree?
Well, I try not to feel guilty about any of my pleasures. So
good point. Good point.
So I don't know if I have any guilty pleasures, but I have been watching a lot of French TV on Netflix. There's a show called Call My Agent that I really love. There's 3 seasons of it. And there's another show whose name I'm totally blanking on that I just watched. It's another French show. And I don't know, there's something just very enjoyable about watching these French TV shows. So
also, it's a degree of separation from everyday life too. If you're having a completely different language, then it can't be the reality you're living in.
That's such a good point. Yes, that is such a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Becky was wondering, Maisie travels a lot. How do you get into the mindset to write about a different location and era when you're home in California?
I drop into it very easily. If need be, I close the curtains, and I work. And I've got the air conditioning on if it's a hot day. And I think the thing is, it's really interesting. Your Doree's questions have brought up questions in my mind. I think actually having been something of a solitary child, it allows me to do this. I drop into my imagination. It's like, boom, Alice in Wonderland, straight down the hole. And I'm into this place. It's very easy for me to go there. And sometimes, to be quite honest, I'll, you know, stop work at about 1 o'clock. And this happened to me once in a big way. I came out of my home office and I thought, oh, I just walk into the garden. The sun is, whoa, it's sunny and it's California. I was so in my head in London, in the rain, in winter, that it was a shock. So, but I think this is something a lot of writers do, and you really have to drop into your place, even if it's only a couple of years ago, even if it's whether it's in the future. But you set a scene, you know where this is, and you're just boink, you're there, and you're writing, and you have to be there. And when I write, I can see my scenes happening. I don't see words on the page. I see the whole scene, and sometimes I see it so much I actually don't get it on the page. And you know, my editor might say to me, Jackie, I know this is in your head. I know you can see it, but you can see it so well, you haven't written about it at all. So I think that's my answer, that I just drop in. And of course I have to drop in because I work to deadlines. So there's no ifs, ands or buts. I've got to go there.
Well, I think that ties in, you know, I've heard you speak before. So you said Maisie as a character sprang fully formed into your head. So maybe it's just, you know her, and especially after so many books, right? It has to be like revisiting a friend.
Sometimes it's like revisiting a friend, and sometimes it's like, okay, I'm back again. You know, I do know her, and but I don't know all of her. And I think that's the wonderful thing about writing a series. That is a gift that writing a series gives you. And I have written a standalone novel, so there was a different experience there. And I had a chance to figure this out early on, that as well as there being an arc to each story, there would be an overall arc to Maisie's story. And I really wanted to see how people grow and change, my characters could grow and change over time, and how experience could inform them and change their attitudes and make them almost different people at times. And how the people, for example, you know, Mark Scott, and for those who haven't got this far, I'm not going to say much, but Mark Scott coming sort of crossing paths with Maisie. He's a very different character, and he brings out a different character in her, as does Robert Macfarlane, you know. So I love exploring these, and having those characters also have their own arc, and the place has its arc as well. So that's something that I love to create.
Well, and you mentioned that, you know, obviously the character has gone through some growth over the series, but you have not shied away from putting her through tragedy either. And that leads into our question from Rebecca, which is it hard to write difficult storylines for Maisie since she's such a beloved character?
It is and it isn't, because, you know, that's life. We all have our ups and downs. And if you think of what people have gone through, I mean, look at what people have gone through this year. But, you know, I think of someone like my grandmother, who's, that would be my mother's mother. Her brother died of his wounds in the First World War. And she was partially blinded in a munitions factory. And then she saw 3 of her own kids go to war. And she had to say goodbye to her other kids who were evacuated. And you see the arc of some people's stories. These things happened to people. So I'm not just making up stuff for Maisie to go through. It's that, so, oh my gosh, she's really putting her character through it. People go through difficult times. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to bring out was the ability of people to endure and have a certain resilience, which doesn't make them hard. It just gives them the ability to go on. So do I feel guilty about putting her through that? You know, it's actually, interestingly enough, or do I find it difficult? It was when I wrote Pardonable Lies, there was a couple of points. There was a point where she had a breakdown, and that was both difficult. I knew exactly what would happen to her, but I sort of had to put myself through it to do it, so to speak. And here's a question I think a lot of writers ask themselves: how would I feel if? And my question was, how would I feel if I had seen death of a most terrible kind at a very impressionable age, and then at 30 odd, I go back to that place? How would I feel if? And I realized I would fall to my knees because I wouldn't be able to stand up. And funnily enough, I asked myself that question when I too was visiting what was actually a casualty clearing station cemetery on the Western Front. And I knew that I would set my scene in that book, in that place. And I was standing there in the rain that you get, you know, in that part of the world. And you hear soldiers talking about the driving rain across the trenches. And I remember standing there and thinking, you know, how would I feel if I had gone through what Maisie has gone through, and including being wounded? And then she revisits that place where she not only saw death of a most terrible kind, but experienced her other people dying around her that she worked with. How would I feel if? And I knew I would fall to my knees. So I had to write that scene. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, that answers my question.
Yeah.
I think that the realistic emotion that you put in your fiction obviously is completely relevant to the memoir that we have going on today and your family's story. I'm so appreciative when we have guest interviewers, moderators. I'd like to give Doree just a chance to talk about Thanks for Waiting, which comes out next year and is her memoir. And I think that people would love to hear about it. I know I would. One of the wonderful things about hearing other people's stories, especially the stories that, you know, might not be the cheeriest at times, is it normalizes what you're feeling. And so, you know, you may not be writing about what you went through, but when you hear that other people went through it and they came out okay on the other side, and, you know, it's a shared experience, and it's so helpful. So anyway, Doree, why don't you tell us about Thanks for Waiting?
Well, thank you for asking. Thanks for Waiting comes out at the end of June 29th. And It's called Thanks for Waiting, the Joy and Weirdness of Being a Late Bloomer. And it's really just about how I'm kind of doing things on my own timeline. Some people might say I'm doing things quote unquote late, but I'm doing them on my own timeline. And it goes through kind of my struggles to get to a point where I felt kind of comfortable and confident saying that I was doing things on my own timeline, and also some of the other struggles that we went through to have a family, and that I think I've talked about publicly but haven't written a ton about. So that is all in there too.
Wonderful.
I'm really looking forward to that memoir, actually.
Oh, thank you so much.
No, when I read about it, I thought this is going to speak to me, because I'm a little bit the same. I mean, I was, when my first novel was published, I was 47. I was, as my mother would have said, no spring chicken. But and I think sometimes, we do feel that we've got to do things at a pace that other people do it, and sometimes suddenly it's like not being the fastest runner at the school. Sometimes it's okay not to run with the pack. It's okay not to run with the pack. And I'm so looking forward to your memoir, really.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I will send you a copy.
Thank you.
So, Doree, I understand you have a little one to put to bed. We have put our solid presentation together. Unfortunately, it's the time of the night when we're going to sign off, but I know that I have enjoyed this so much. It's been an absolute delight talking with you two. And Doree, again, thanks for coming on and interviewing Jackie. Jackie, I will see you probably virtually in March for the new Maisie, but it's been a delight today. Thank you all for tuning in. As I said, we have signed copies available, and we hope to see you in store soon, and if not in store, on another one of our upcoming virtual events. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.